talk about today is the idea of mobilizing the enterprise but doing it securely. And actually the talk we just have sat through a few minutes ago talked in quite detail about some of the stuff we'll kind of touch on here, so it's actually quite closely tied in. And I suppose what I'm trying to think about here is that the solution to one problem shouldn't create another problem, if that makes sense. So as we go along, you'll see hopefully what I mean on that. But first things first, I'm going to take you back in time a bit. So we're all familiar with the TV program Reeling in the Years, right? We've all watched that on TV. Where are we going? Okay, good. So I'm going to ask you to think about what year this happened in. Okay, so there's a bunch of little factoids here that you might recognize. If you're really nerdy, you'll be able to tell me that in this year there was 10,000, all of 10,000, can you imagine? Websites on the internet. That was the actual Microsoft website from this year, would you believe? Anybody got it yet? No? Okay, you don't want to be a super nerd to get that one, right? It was the year that Netscape Navigator launched. Quick show of hands in the room, whoever used Netscape Navigator here? Yep. Deadly buzz. Okay, we're not the only ones. Netscape Navigator was cool. It was the really good one for a while, right? And then it just disappeared. This was the year that the first ever e-commerce transaction happened, right? And that was as claimed by Pizza Hut, believe it or not. There's some dispute. There's within a week or two, somebody else may have done one, but Pizza Hut pretty much seemed to have it nailed in this particular year. It was also the year that Amazon launched, and that was what Amazon used to look like back then, right? So this is Amazon.com selling books on the internet, literal paper books. Anybody got it yet? Are you Googling now? No, okay, no Googling allowed. And the pinnacle of mobile tech, to tie it back to mobile, was this thing called the IBM Simon. Any IBM nerds in the room will remember that. So that was essentially a PDA and a phone kind of melded together in some way, shape or form. Pretty slick, actually, at the time. Okay, so if you've got it from that, fantastic. If not, I'll give you a couple of cultural reference points for that same year. The first one was Pulp Fiction. Arguably the movie of the year. I don't know whether it was critically the movie of the year that year, but certainly for me it's one of the ones I remember from that year as being particularly good. Getting closer in now, you definitely should get it at this point. It was the year that Riverdance wowed the world, the nation and the world at the Eurovision Song Contest in what was the Point Depot at the time, and is now of course the 3 Arena. And finally, if you haven't got it from all of that, you should definitely get it from this. It was the year that Ireland played Italy in Giant Stadium in New York, in the USA. So have you got it yet? It should be 1994, which is exactly what you've all got to. Brilliant. So it was the year that Paul Harrington and Charlie McGettigan actually won the Eurovision, but nobody remembers that because essentially Riverdance won the Eurovision that year. It was my favourite Eurovision song as a matter of interest. So anyway, why am I talking about 1994 in such detail? It was actually the year I left college. So I walked out of UCD down the road here, qualified as a freshly minted electronic engineer in 1994, and breathlessly took on the world from there on in. But at that time, the technology in the world was very different. And just as a kind of a pointer, we start to think about some of the things that didn't exist in 1994. Pretty much anything on your phone that you're looking at nowadays didn't exist in 1994. So Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, Twitter, Snapchat, Dropbox, Internet Explorer, believe it or not, didn't exist in 1994. It's hard to believe. Some other things that didn't exist in 1994, Amazon certainly as we know it now, and eBay definitely as we know it now, as e-commerce transactional entities definitely didn't exist back then. Windows 95, as the name would suggest, had a year to go before it would come. Google hadn't started and wouldn't start for several years after that. Yahoo, similarly, hadn't even started. So this is really going back in time. And I don't know about you, anybody else in the room feel like 1994 was like yesterday? Like, yeah, I know. I'm kind of aging myself now, and a few of you in the room, but you get what I mean. Obviously, the iPhone would be, 10 plus years before they'd even thought of that, right? And smartwatches were things that we saw on the likes of Dick Tracy and James Bond, right? They weren't things any of us had, unless you maybe had a calculator on a watch, which were really cool. The other things that didn't exist were mobile video. So the idea that you could walk around with, live TV streaming on a device in your hand was unthinkable back then. By the way, anybody who's out there, feel free to come in and sit down. You're more than welcome. And the idea that Netflix would be this force in the world that would give you TV on demand. I don't know about you guys, but we couldn't have imagined it, right? It was absolutely unimaginable at the time that would be the case. Because as somebody earlier on showed us, it was the era of dial-up broadband. It was also the era of 2G mobile. So GPRS hadn't come around, Edge hadn't come around, and certainly 3 and 4G and now 5G definitely hadn't been thought of, right? So we really are going back in time. And just in case you didn't feel old enough already, all of us of a certain age, people in the room, none of these people existed in 1994 because they were all, as it happens, born in 1995. Now, I'm probably similar to many of you in this room in that I don't know who the hell most of these people are either, right? But I think one of them is some sort of a Kardashian thing, and then there's some things called YouTubers that my kids tell me are awesome. I haven't a freaking clue what they're all about, right? I like YouTube for like watching MSNBC videos about how shit Donald Trump is, but that's just me, right? So that's my little fishbowl that I swim around in, okay? So, like, none of this existed in 1994, and really the world has changed quite dramatically since. And if we think about it from a business point of view, the business world that we all started in, I don't know when you guys all started, but since I started, an awful lot of things have changed. And an awful lot of things are out there now that we didn't have to deal with. So, the idea of hackers for everyone, right? I'm not going to read all these individually, by the way, so don't panic. The idea of hackers for everyone, we talked earlier on about all these different security threats that we're seeing nowadays. Back then, hackers went after the CIA, or they went after, you know, gold bullion in you know, Fort Knox or something like that. They didn't try and hack your home computer because, well, they couldn't have for a start. It was a dial-up internet connection. So it wasn't really something we had to worry about. And from a business point of view, we weren't even really aware of it all that much at the time. Things like all the connectivity, USB, Bluetooth, NFC, none of that existed, right? These are all new things. Things like mobile payment, online banking. What were they? We didn't have mobile, so we didn't have payment. One of my favorites, deperimeterization, the idea that your perimeter of your network is now fractured into N pieces, where N is your number of employees times however many devices they have. So your perimeter of your organization that you held secure for many years is now basically in my pocket here, and it's as secure as that is, okay? Data protection, as we said, we couldn't go through without mentioning GDPR. But never mind GDPR, the 1995 Data Protection Act hadn't even come out at that stage, so we're way back when. So there's a lot of things that, you know, the idea that rush hour is now 3 hours long and people live in a thing called the commuter belt. Nobody would have known what a commuter belt was back then. And all of these things are now pressing in on the average IT department and scaring the bejesus out of them. And we're all trying to deal with these threats. But also, not all these things are threats. Some of these things are fabulous opportunities for change in the working environment. And I suppose the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we go about leveraging some of these changes without frustrating the hell out of our users, okay? Because we want to try and protect our users from the threats, and we also want to expose, you know, some of the benefits of these things to them. But at the same time, we have to be careful and mindful that we need to look after our organizational security. And some of the stuff we heard about earlier on is very important in that. And really, if you think about how you're going to do that, for the classical scholars in the room up there, that's King Canute standing trying to hold back the tide. And really holding back the tide doesn't work. As any of you who work in an IT organization will know, the tide is coming in and it's going to come in no matter what you do. What you've got to really do is figure out, as an enterprise, as a small business, as a government agency, how do we leverage some of these things? How do we get the benefit out of them? And how do we also make sure that our users take advantage of them without shadow IT becoming a major problem? What does shadow IT mean? Anybody know what shadow IT means? Everybody familiar with it? Essentially, shadow IT is the idea that if you don't give your users a file sharing application that is secure, they will just use Dropbox. Why? Because it works and it's easy. Is it secure? Possibly, probably not. They will use WhatsApp for messaging if you don't give them something, you know, corporate flavored to use. And WhatsApp is not a safe way to do things, right? We all know that. Because apart from anything else, if you end up with a WhatsApp group with all your staff talking in it, that's probably next in line to that person's school, you know, WhatsApp group about their kids and their GAA team and their soccer team or whatever else it might be. And the idea that information can bleed between those isn't exactly a huge jump, right? How many people have done the sorry, wrong group message? We've all done that? Sorry, whoops, delete for all. So how does the enterprise deal with it? Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 easy steps. These aren't going to solve everything, but they are some things that I think would work. And the idea would be that you leverage those opportunities, but you mitigate some of the risks, if that makes sense. So the first thing I would advocate to my customers is a cloud-first strategy. And, you know, when I talk to my customers, do you ever hear that story about the fella down in Killarney and he leans into the car of the chap that's just stopped to ask for directions, and your man goes, "How do I get to Tralee?" And the fella from Kerry looks at him and goes, "Well, I wouldn't start from here if I were you." So, unfortunately, a business nowadays has to start from where they're at, if that makes sense. So, cloud first is great if you're starting from absolute scratch. Very few of us are starting from scratch. But as we start to, refresh our infrastructure, can we think about using cloud services as a kind of a first step? Yeah. And what that really means is consuming services that are built with security from the ground up. It means buying services that are flexible and can be deployed in a flexible way, meaning you can use a public cloud, you can use a private cloud, or you can use a mixture of both, a hybrid approach. And what that can do for you is that can really reduce the IT overhead. So if you are buying a service, you don't need to have all the people internally to mind the servers, to patch the servers. You're just buying a service. And speaking of services, as a service is the other, the next piece that I would think of really, which is to buy on a kind of an as-a-service basis for pretty much anything that you can think of. So we were familiar with software as a service over the years, SaaS as it's been known, but we've also heard of unified communications as a service, infrastructure as a service. So pretty much anything you can think of from an IT services point of view nowadays can be bought as a service. And what that means is you're not paying huge amounts up front. So the idea of that low or zero capex. And you're really buying it on a predictable monthly pay per user per month basis. And we're all familiar with the pay per user per month basis because most of us do it for this, right? So we're familiar with this. Most of us don't buy this with capex. Most of us are handed one of these things for next to nothing, except we are buying, but we just pay for it over 2 years. And so in infrastructural terms, what we can do now is we can structure, over a 1 to 5 year contract that you can have a brand new telephone system without paying a whole lot up front, and you just pay for it over 5 years or 3 years or whatever makes sense. And you can do that with networks, and you can do it with software, you can do it whatever. And then you pay as you grow. And the other piece I would say is centralize your services as much as possible. So if you have multiple sites within your organization, what you really want to make sure is that your services are located in one place. For a couple of reasons. One is that all of your different sites then have access to those services. And the second thing is that your remote workers who may not come into the office and may work from home or may work from abroad or whatever it might be, can still access those same central services as everybody else. And that again has that effect of reducing shadow IT, because if you give the services to your users and they're accessible from wherever they are, then they're going to use them, if they're good services, right? Don't buy crap services, that's the other thing, but I can't put that up there. And what that will allow you to do then is you deploy it in one place, and if it goes wrong, you fix it in one place. So it's not a panacea for everything, but it certainly makes things an awful lot easier to deal with. And I suppose the underpinning thing for all of that is this idea of smart networking, okay? So we think about the networks of the past and the networks of the present and the future. What we're starting to really get is, if you've got a multi-site organization, you want all of those sites connected together. And what you really are better doing is using a centralized, a central hub that's not you. So what we often meet is customers who have one of two setups. Either, I'll give you an example of a forecourt retailer. I won't mention their name in here, it's not fair. But they had 160 sites across the country in Ireland, petrol stations. Every one of them had its own internet connection, and every one of those internet connections had its own firewall. So do the maths, that's 160 firewalls. You want to be that IT manager driving around the country patching those firewalls? No thanks. That's a recipe for stress and disaster. So what we did for them is we took all of those individual internet connections, brought them into us in our data center, and then gave them a managed firewall back out to the internet. So now they have one place where they get to the internet and one firewall. And now they're patching it in one situation. And it's managed, and it's monitored, and everything else besides. So it completely changes how they go about doing things. So if we're connecting all our sites together and we're centralizing our security, the other thing that we get from having a managed network like that is visibility of our resources. So when we think about our resources, often we think about human resources, but also we're talking about network resources. So if you think about a retailer, for example, your network resource could be something as simple as a payment machine at a till. And when you think about what that payment machine at a till should do, it should take in the information from the customer, it should validate the card, and it should send that information to, let's say, Relex or whoever it is that's the payment engine, and it should do absolutely nothing else, right? It should go nowhere else. But maybe it is. Maybe that credit card machine has been compromised, as we heard earlier on with some of those hacking stories, and it's now sending information off to a Russian website or off to a place in China that it shouldn't be going. When we have a managed network, we can start to see those things. We can apply analytics and intelligence against our network resources and flag when something's going wrong, if that makes sense. So it just gives you that level of extreme visibility of all of your network elements, and it reports on things that shouldn't be going on that are. And I suppose the other thing a network in that configuration does is it prepares you for the future in terms of as networks turn into SD or software-defined networks, you're then prepared to kind of take that step when it's right for your business to do it. That may be today or tomorrow, or it could be in 5 years' time. But that's really where the world is going. So what we can do then is when we have taken our business and we've wrapped it in all of those four things, we now have a network that's managed. We can manage our mobility, so we can put manage mobility on our mobile devices to keep them protected. We can put security levels around our network, and we can buy services from an ICT provider that are going to be as a service. What that will allow us to do then is really mitigate some of those threats. Now, my last speaker, as I was listening to him, or the last speaker that was here, specifically said, you won't keep everything out. And I was thinking of this slide going, bugger, I kept them all out, and that's not right. So you can imagine that one or two of those got through, but anyway, you get where I'm coming from. The idea is to try and keep the bad stuff out, and then let the good stuff in. Okay, so you're trying to leverage those things that are good for your employees and for your business as a whole, and you're trying to keep everything else away from your business. And so the idea should be then that those stressed out IT folks that we met earlier on should have it nice and easy. Anybody here work in IT? You know that doesn't happen, right? It's not quite as simple as that. But the idea would be that I did have a customer recently who, when I was talking to them, we described this sort of stuff to him, and he said to me, what do I do after this is all done? And he meant that genuinely. He was actually worried, I'll be out of a job. And we said, no, you won't. What you'll become is the strategic partner to your business customers for driving change forward in your organization. He went, oh, I like that. Can I put that on my business card? And we said, yeah, if you can get a business card big enough for that, knock yourself out. It should also make that your users are a little bit happier, okay? Because your users will be more productive, and they'll get better services from you as an IT department. And I suppose the last thing then to think about is analytics. So more and more nowadays we're hearing, you'll hear it in a lot of the different talks today, which is there's a lot of data out there. I met recently with a very large pharmaceutical organization, and they said to me, Stephen, we have been collecting data for years. We just haven't got a clue what to do with it. Right? So they've been collecting all this data from their production line, from various different places. They just don't know what to do with it, right? So the idea would be you've got analytic programs that can now run against all this data and give you insights into what's happening in your business, okay? So that production data can tell you that sensor over there has been out of tolerance for the last 3 hours, and we know that 89% of the time when a sensor's been out of tolerance for 3 hours, there's a 94% chance that piece of equipment is going to malfunction in the next 3 weeks. What are you going to do? You're going to take down that production line, take that piece out, and put another one in and carry on, as opposed to that thing malfunctioning and your production line being off the road for 3 weeks. Yeah, so you can start to read. The big thing with analytics is so what? Always ask yourself, so what? I've got data, so what? I've got information, so what? What does it tell me about my business? What decisions does it allow me to take as a business? Okay?